Hello and welcome back to the PROMAC series of lectures on various topics. Today we are going to do a little bit of in-depth study in terms of reading comprehension. Most of us, no matter what kind of exam we face, we have difficulties comprehending passages. Especially for examinations like the SAT, we have a lot of difficulty tackling critical reading section. Now, the critical reading is difficult not just because of the vocabulary section, but also because of the reading passage questions. Now, very often, there are chock-a-block kind of books which tell you a lot of different strategies, but no one particular strategy can be suitable to all mindsets, simply because we have different reading capabilities, we have different reading habits, we have different reading skills, we've been taught a number of different things. So uniformity in terms of interpretation, in terms of the critical reading passages that are given, would become a little bit difficult when it comes to a competitive exam like the SAT. However, if we try to look at the types of questions that we might face and the types of passages that we might come across on an exam like the SAT, the College Board tries to define a few of the types of the passages and so on. So it makes it a little easier to understand what is required from us when we are trying to do this particular type of test. Now, when we look at reading comprehension passages, we have long passages, then we have short passages, we have singular long passages, singular short passages, and dual passages, which most of us find difficult to handle. Like I said earlier, we find dual passages, or for that matter any passage, difficult to handle simply because of the reading skills that we might or we might not have. So let's take a look at the type of passages that we might get on the SAT. Now, if you take a look at this, you can divide the SAT passages into three types. One is rough division, that is, you have the analytical passages. Then you have argumentative passages. And you have narrative passages. What exactly is the difference between an analytical passage to an argumentative passage from a narrative passage? What are the differences? Let's take each of these things and take a look at it. What does an analytical passage look like? An analytical passage is very neat in its presentation because there is a clear-cut introduction. After the introduction, you have the middle portion in which you might have examples. You might have any kind of data, you might have any kind of contrasting ideas, whatever. After that, we will have a very neat conclusion. As the name suggests, it is analytical in its purview simply because it analyzes. It takes one particular topic in the introduction and it analyzes in different ways. Now, when you come in the analytical type of comprehension passage, you will have an explanation of perhaps a phenomenon, followed by how this phenomenon is developed. This comprises the rest of the body paragraphs or rest of the paragraphs in the reading comprehension, how the phenomenon is developed and how it is concluded. In this development of the analytical type of passage, they might use a lot of examples. There can be a debate. That means there could be a presentation of contrasting ideas. So an analytical passage is easy to understand because the way it is focused or the way it is divided is very clear. And the first paragraph of the passage, or the first few lines, if it's a single paragraph, the first few lines of the passage would be discussing a particular phenomenon. For example, I have taken phenomenon only as an example. It could be the statement of a concept. It could be a statement of a theory. It could be anything which is developed either in terms of examples, or it could be developed in terms of contrasting ideas, and then followed by a conclusion. Conclusion invariably can have what we call as the author's take or the author's opinion on whatever the phenomenon, concept or theory, if at all he wants to make a statement. Right. Now, after the analytical type of passage, let's take a look at the argumentative type of passage. What exactly do we mean when we say argumentative type of passage? As the name suggests, argumentative type of passage would imply that there would be logical analysis, there would be reasoning, and when there is reasoning, you could also have questions based on flaws in the reasoning, if there are flaws in the reasoning. Very clearly manifest in the type of questions that you might get to see in this type of passage. So, in an argumentative essay, the introduction, the development, and the conclusion are not very clear, but we might take the help of the rhetorical devices that are used in an argumentative essay. What is the meaning of a rhetorical device? A rhetorical device can take any form. It could be in the form of statistics. It could be in the form of, say for example, data. It could be in the form of counter examples. It could be in the form of anecdotes. Any of these are what we call as rhetorical devices. What is an anecdote? An anecdote is any kind of personal experience that is narrated in the form of a story. So that could also be from the author's perspective. When it is from a personal perspective or when it is from the author's perspective, there could be a flaw in the reasoning when you look at it objectively. Remember, all reading comprehension passages, no matter what type of passage you are looking at, whether you are looking at an analytical passage, whether you are looking at an argumentative passage, or whether you are going to be looking at a narrative passage, all these types of passages would always have some kind of examples that are mentioned, and there would be a logical connectivity among all these elements. Right. Now, if you look at rhetorical devices as such, examples are given, counter examples are given, anecdotes are given, statistics are given. All these would help to explain the point that the author is trying to make. We simply call it argumentative simply because there could be a flaw in reasoning. Not necessary that there will be a flaw, but there could be a flaw. So, an argumentative type of reading comprehension passage would be a little more difficult to understand when compared with an analytical type of passage. Alright, now after the argumentative type of passage, you will also be acquainted with a narrative type of passage. A narrative type of passage is where you have a conflict. That means there is an issue that is discussed. So the conflict is there. When there is a conflict, the conflict is stated in the introduction. Then there is an explanation of the conflict. And then there is resolution of a conflict. So, as is true of the analytical type of reading comprehension passage, in the narrative passage also you will have 3 clear-cut areas which has an introduction wherein they give you a background about the kind of topic that is being discussed, and then they give you a counter example or a counterpoint to that, and then there is an answer to all the questions that are raised throughout the passage. So these are the 3 major types of passages that you might encounter on your SATs. The SATs are difficult simply because we are taking the passage as a whole and trying to look at it subjectively. Remember, not just for the SAT, but anywhere, whenever you are tested on a reading comprehension passage, the objective is only to see what kind of analytical mind or logical mind you have. You are not expected to have any kind of prior knowledge about any particular topic that is being dealt with. So you might have a passage of nanotechnology and you might be a BBA student with no knowledge about nanotechnology, but you are not expected to have any kind of knowledge about the contents of any kind of extra knowledge about the contents of the reading comprehension passage. However, you are required to understand the contents of the reading comprehension passage as they are given and in a very objective fashion. What is the meaning of objectively looking at something? Now, there are 2 different ways of looking at any given factor. There is what we call as an objective outlook, and there is something called a subjective outlook. An objective outlook is what we want to interpret any kind of reading comprehension passage. So what is objectivity? Objectivity is when a certain sentence is given, you take it as a matter of fact. You don't bring in your extra information, no matter how true it is. You don't bring your extra information and try to give it an extra dimension. That should never be done, no matter how logical it is. Because remember, if you do that, your interpretation of the passage would be different from what is expected of you. The answer options that you would find would perhaps complement the thinking that you have in terms of subjectivity. That means you would end up choosing an incorrect answer. You wouldn't be able to find the right answer if you try to look at it in a very subjective fashion. So when we say subjective, we are saying our own ideas. We are also saying whatever prior knowledge we might have about the topic that is being discussed in the reading comprehension. We do not want any kind of subjective ideas. We do not want to interpret or give our opinion about what we think, or whether we think something is right or incorrect, whether we want to say some other person's viewpoint is justified or whether somebody's point is not justified. It is not our job to do that. Our job is to only complement the ideas that are mentioned in the reading comprehension passage. Nothing more, nothing less. And in order to do that, you should have an objective look at every component that is given, no matter what the question. Even if the question says, what according to you, even if it begins like that, you cannot give your own ideas, because the extension would be, what according to you is the author's tone of the passage. So essentially, the question is about the author's tone. It is not so much about you. Correct? So therefore, objective outlook for the reading comprehension is critical if you're going to get any kind of competence in dealing with this. Correct? Right. So let's take a look at what are the strategies that we might adopt when we are looking at passages. Now, there are lots of different techniques that people follow depending on the reading speed, depending on the understanding that a person might have about a given topic. So, it's always better to tackle reading comprehension, or rather critical reading passages, in a way that would save you time and also give you a perfect understanding of the contents of the passage. Now, in order to do that, there are different ways. You can skim read the passage. What is the meaning of skim reading the passage? Skim reading the passage is quickly running across all the lines of the passage to get an overall view of what the reading passage is actually stating. This is one way. You can also have what we call as the blind technique. I call it the blind reading technique. Why do I call it the blind reading technique? Because in this technique, we are taking a look at the questions first. The question first and then the passage. So, why do we call this blind reading? Because when we are taking a look at the question, we do not know what the passage is all about. We do not know what is the argumentative mode, or whether it is a narrative, whether it is analytical. We have no idea about the passage and how it is presented. Without that idea, we are taking a look at the question first and then beginning to read the passage. Now, there is an advantage in this, there is an advantage in this. Now, what is the advantage of reading the question first? When you read the question first, you can have what we call as an active phase of reading. When you read the passage first, this is what we call as the passive phase of reading. Why do we call that as a passive phase of reading? Simply because we are reading the passage without any kind of objectivity. In other words, we do not have a purpose delineated in our minds for the reason for reading the passage. Whereas when we read the question first and then the passage, we have a particular area we are looking for. So, which technique goes for what type of question is again dependent on the question type. Alright, now if you take a look at these passages, many a time we see that the length of the passage is a detriment. If the passage is, say, about 80 lines long, immediately there is a mind block. We say, oh my God, now this is a very dry passage. Now this is like 80 lines. Who is interested in reading 80 lines? I have no aptitude for this, and there is a mental block. Now when you block your mind like that, what happens is automatically your comprehension abilities also go down. So let the length of the passage not bother you, because you can segregate the lengths into different types. Because on the SAT what happens is, this is passage based, these passage based questions will always be in a linear order. What exactly do we mean by linear order? By linear order, we mean that the first question will be in the first paragraph, let's say. Second question will be after the information for the first question. Third will be after the information for the third question, and so on and so forth. So they are all presented in a linear fashion. So once you do the first question, you might just read the first question, read the first paragraph, and then try to tackle it, though this does not cover your entire passage.